welcome, and thanks to our session on building sustainable and resilient supply chains. On behalf of LR and LR Foundation, we're so glad to have you here in the room and virtually. And it's been a very interesting week, and we all know that the key aims of this past week have been to secure a global net zero and keep to 1.5 degrees, to adopt and protect communities and natural habitats, and to mobilize finance and work together for effective change. But keeping to 1.5 it's not a political target, it's a real target, and the science is there. So we need to cut emissions dramatically to avoid the most devastating effects. And without immediate actions, the oceans are no longer going to be the remarkable reservoirs of biodiversity and the critical resource that we all need. You know, when you think about it, there's so many examples, but just one example is if we go to 1.5, then all of the water coral in the world is expected to die. And that matters because a quarter of the marine species depend on healthy corals, and over 1 billion people around the world have marine protein as their main source of protein. So the link between human life, the ocean, and the climate is profound. And so this past week has been good, and it's been interesting because oceans have risen on the agenda. And oceans and ocean industries have been at the center of the dialogues. John Kerry, the US Special Envoy for the Climate, said, "The ocean is climate and the climate is ocean, and you can't solve one without the other." But at the same time that we're making the effort to protect the ocean, we also need to take more from our ocean resources, and that means developing ocean industries, so food, power, transportation, trade. And these are the makings of what we're seeing of building a sustainable ocean economy. We're seeing this emerge, and we also are seeing better stewardship of our blue resources emerge. When we think about the blue economy, it highlights the links that we're going to be talking about today. So trade and productivity, human well-being, oceans, climate, and the health of our planet. Helen mentioned that most of what's traded around the world travels across the ocean, and that's why resilient and sustainable supply chains are a critical component of the blue economy. We have lots to unpack with our panel today, but we're going to hear about safer ocean infrastructure, the role of procurement and end users in shipped goods, shipping ambitions to decarbonize, and how this transition can be done in an equitable way. We're also going to hear about the role of these supply chains through the lens of the healthcare sector. Because the importance of supply chains in a functioning healthcare system has become only too apparent in these past couple of years. During the pandemic, we've seen the highlighting of another critical link between the ocean as a resource and human health. But the overarching goal of our session today can be about how we can build ocean infrastructure that supports resilience, and how these resilient supply chains can contribute towards climate action and a healthier, more productive ocean. So I want to turn first to somebody who knows about the ocean, and that's Ambassador Peter Thompson, who's currently serving as the Secretary General at the UN's Special Envoy for the Ocean. He was the first person to be named in this position. Ambassador Thompson is a Fijian diplomat. He was president of the UN General Assembly. He was permanent representative from Fiji to the UN, and he's been a tireless champion fighting for the ocean. We've seen him around the world traveling for years. And he's here at COP this week to help us understand the importance of a healthy ocean, but also why the ocean is our ally in fighting the climate change. Ambassador Thompson.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I'll just wear my brand for a little bit longer, if you don't mind, and then I can take it down. But You know, it's your brand too. We all agreed to this in 2015 when we signed on to the Sustainable Development Goals. This is SDG 14, to conserve and sustainably use the ocean's resources. So it's all about getting the balance right, getting our relationship with nature back into sync, which obviously demands much greater respect than we've been giving it. You know, I was here for my first speaking engagement, it seems like a lifetime ago, Monday last week, and kind of been the first because we had a dinner and I discovered the whiskey bar, and that's actually the last whiskey that I had. I've been in Glasgow for a week, can you believe it? And the only whiskey I had was a couple of Glenmorangies here a week ago. But anyway, I pass that on to you as a bit of local knowledge. What has just been said is all true. I would correct you on the corals. We lose 70 to 90%, according to IPCC, we lose 70 to 90% of tropical coral reefs now existing when we get to 1.5. When we get to 2 degrees, we lose virtually all, you know, up in the high 90%. But I mean, your main message is on the money because, you know, we're currently heading to 3 degrees by the end of this century. And that's WMO, that's not me. I mentioned WMO, the World Meteorological Organization. I was having lunch with my friend Petri Talas, who runs that organization. I said, Petri, you and I are often described as the prophets of doom. And he said, yeah, I mean, but you know, what else can I do? He's the chief weatherman of the planet, right? He's not some nefarious politician trying to sell something. The weather people in all our towns, I used to be one when I was a young guy as a rural development officer. I had my rain gauge and my weather vane, which I reported every day to the capital. And what does the capital do with it? They use it for local weather forecasting and everything, but then they send it off Geneva and WMO, our best weather people in the world, put it all together. And that's the best predictions we can get on climate and weather is what we've got there in Geneva. And they say the best of their indications, year after year, nothing to disprove it scientifically yet, that we're heading to 3 degrees global warming by the end of this century. That's a world on fire. And I've got skin in that game because I've got 4 granddaughters, and Rosie here, who lives with me in London at the moment, she's going to be 80 at the end of this century. And 3 degrees means she's going to spend the last 30 years of her life, you know, putting out fires and digging up corpses from mudslides and flattened villages. You know, we're already doing that in Fiji, but you know, we're doing that once every 10 years when you get a monster hurricane, a couple of times a year now, average. But by then, at 3 degrees, that's all just going to be, you know, tripled and tripled and tripled. So we're going to refuse that future. That's the obvious thing. The prophets of doom like Petri Talas and I say that because it's the truth, and then we'd say, okay, but what we're going to do about it, right? And so that's the purpose of it. And I have to tell you, the Secretary General of the United Nations, he doesn't make a speech on this subject without ringing Petri Talas to check his facts first. And the Secretary General of the United Nations recently announced a red alert for humanity. You know, it's not some guy on a soapbox in Hyde Park Corner. This is the Secretary General of the United Nations who's got nothing other than responsibility for the nations of this planet and our well-being. He's got nothing else to sell. Red alert for humanity. Where does WMO and shipping sit in all that? Where do you sit in the red alert, which is the context of our times, and looking after our children, your grandchildren, mine? We know that bunker fuel is one of the dirtiest forms of fossil fuel. We've been using it now for, 100 years maybe? I'm very proud of it, that my forebears, who were from Scotland, arrived. He was a master mariner, Captain Petrie from Arbroath, arrived in the days of sail, you know. People got around the world under sail, trading back and forward. And Rosie's grandmother, who's Fijian, indigenous Fijian, They traded back and forth across the Pacific Islands for 4,000 years without thinking about burning bunker fuel to get us there, what, faster, more trade or whatever. You know, we're human beings. We've become strange creatures on this planet. And we've got to get back into a relationship with nature, as I said. And that first day here, was a day of great jubilation for me, because I've been following this greening of shipping thing for a while through Davos and, the coalition for getting to zero that WEF has. I was part of the formation of that and everything. We've been talking. But to come here on Monday last week and have that chap from, I don't know if any of you were here, the chap from the Norwegian ferry companies, who said that all of their tenders that they've put out now for all their new ferries, they're the main ferry company in Norway, gigantic coast Norway's got, are all for hydrogen-powered vessels. And they've put out the tenders for all their hydrogen bunkering points in, I think, 15 ports up and down the coast of Norway. It's happening, It's happening. Either you're part of this revolution or you're just going to be consigned to the dustbin of history and the dustbin of your grandchildren's estimations of what you stood for. That's harsh, but it's true, because they're the ones putting out the fires if you don't. And so for me, it's just so hopeful to hear from that Norwegian ferry company. And they've, by the way, they've done, I'm sure you're aware of this, they've done trial runs of a retrofitted boat for the transatlantic trade. They've got the hydrogen tanks up on the deck, and they found they could do it up to 70%. The other 30% they had to complete by diesel, but that was for a retrofitted vessel, and their plans show that if they design it, design built with hydrogen, the 100% Atlantic crossings are totally feasible now. So, great hope. That's greening of shipping. And as soon as the ports get into it, that's where the real money has to be spent. Then ships that are still going on dirty old bunker fuel, I'll be in the front line with all the citizens of that port saying, we don't want that dirty stuff in here. We've got clean hydrogen vessels. We're only going to allow clean hydrogen vessels into our port. And I guarantee you that's going to be a consumer-led movement in the future, that we will only buy goods that come in with clean fuel. So greening of shipping is just one example. The sustainable blue economy is our future. I say to people that I'm up here for three reasons. One is to join the fight to lower our GHG emissions, which is obviously the fight to refuse that 3-degree world. So I'm up here on behalf of these guys, and I suppose on behalf of the UN as well, but primarily for these guys, to join that fight against GHG emissions. And the good news is this is a very different COP. I've been to heaps of them, and this one is different. The people that were trying to white the argument before and say, we're done, no, not necessarily, etc. Anyway, all those people, they've gone off to their expensive villas down in Florida or wherever it is that they all live. They're not here anymore. We're not dealing with them anymore. That fight is won, and we are now dealing with what are the solutions. We've got a monster problem. We're in very dangerous place as a species. The planet's going to be okay, obviously, it'll go on without us, but we as a species are in a very dangerous place. What are we going to do about it? And there's all these solutions coming, and greening of shipping is just one of them. So it's a very different COP, and people like Al Gore know that, have been to all the COPs as well. So as I say, be part of it. So sustainable blue economy, why is the second reason that I'm up here. And I'm up here to try and push that climate finance needle in the direction of the sustainable blue economy. And the good news there is it's shifting. Coral reefs were mentioned. There's 125 million announced by Green Climate Fund just for the Global Fund for Coral Reefs. Canada chucked a 6 million in behind that. And but these are small figures. We're talking about trillions of dollars when we're talking about funding the sustainable blue economy. Why? And trillions of dollars, that rolls off the tongue in these COVID days, Trillions of dollars will be required because that is the future of our children and grandchildren. That's their future. That's where they're going to get their medicines in the post-antibiotic age, and that's already been shown with the COVID crisis. We went down to deep sea vents to get the necessary there. It's going to be in the sustainable food that they're eating. It's going to come from the sea, and it's going to be new forms of food. Food is fashion. I'm speaking on this tonight. They'll be eating very different things. And if that sounds strange, I opened the Fiji embassy in Japan in 1980, and nobody in the world knew about sushi in those days. I remember arriving and talking, what is sushi? It's raw fish wrapped in seaweed, right? Now you can get sushi in the middle of the Congo or the middle of Arkansas. The whole world knows about eating raw fish wrapped in dried seaweed. Food is fashion. So we're going to change the way we eat to sustainable seafoods, not top predators in antibiotic enclosed waters. We're talking about farming the sea in sustainable ways and eating appropriate foods from the sea. We're talking about getting all our energy from the ocean. Tidal, wave, offshore wind. 10 times over the electricity of the world can be supplied by those forces. And we're going to green our shipping. So I actually leave Glasgow. I haven't left yet. I've got to be here to the bitter end on Friday, with a really much more hope than at any COP that I have been in my time. So I really say to you all that I think that the shipping sector is one of the reasons for that different feeling that I have having been at this COP now. Because of that meeting in this room a week ago, I can really see that the shipping industry is moving faster than predicted, faster than the IMO, and that the competition will be those that are moving in that direction will be the winners, and the others will be left at sea, I guess. Okay. Hey guys, thanks very much for listening to me, and you get down to your real work now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's great. Well, have you heard that phrase that they've started saying last week is, it's code red, so we need to back blue? Yeah. Great. Well, thank you very much for that and your reflections and your perspective on the ocean and sustainable ocean economy. So now let's shift to our panel, and if our panel members could come up stage, that would be great. No, just have a seat, and we'll go from thing to thing. But I'm not necessarily going to. Yeah, I'll come join you. No, thanks so much. We have a great session today to talk about sustainable supply chains and safer oceans from various different perspectives. But let's just dig right in. And I want to start with Ruth Bumfrey, who's here, who's the head of strategy and research at the Lloyd's Register Foundation. And Ruth, you've been thinking about oceans for a long time. You're on the boards of a number of ocean scientific research organizations. And tell us what you're thinking in terms of the work that you've been doing to support engineering a safer ocean and how you're thinking about it.
Okay, super. Well, thank you, Suzanne. And I think Peter's left already, but that was a really great introduction to the subject. What I'm thinking is that actually we're all here in this room because we have some expertise and some interest in this subject, and usually I would stand up on a stage and try and convert some people, but I don't think we need to convert people here. I think we're all here because we care about the oceans, we care about what we do to them, and we care about our role in it in the future. So what I'm going to be talking about is some of the things that Lloyd's Register Foundation is pursuing, and also asking and reaching out for partnerships as well for others who want to move in the same direction. I think we're all moving in the same direction, but sometimes we need a bit of coordination, sometimes we need a bit of joining up so we can make that direction faster and smoother. So just thinking about that, so what is it about the oceans which is so important to climate change? Well, there's one thing that we want to do is to move up the agenda to make it more visible. We just saw some amazing Marlin, videos about the massive ocean engineering that happens, which most, 99% of the world won't even know that happens. And there's a lack of visibility in the general population about what happens in the oceans and what our dependence is on it. So we need to raise up the agenda. We're sort of thinking about a concept of ocean citizenship, and I'll get onto that later. But there are two things we want to make visible. Number one, ocean industries. So we talked about shipping. A lot of people will be able to pull out of their heads that 80% of our goods come to us by sea. But actually, where's our connectivity coming from? Where is the subsea cables? Where is our food coming from? The pipelines, the connections, fishing. 24,000, we're a safety charity. Lloyd's Register Foundation is a safety charity. We're based, we get an endowment from Lloyd's Register, which is over 260 years old, and 260 years plus years ago, Lloyd's Register decided that it was going to make the seas safer. So this isn't a new endeavour at all. So we're a charity, and we've got safety. And what, when we get a plate of fish on our plates, do we know that 24,000 fishermen per year die getting that fish to us? This is one of the sort of hidden disgraces that we need to make more visible. So we're going to make these things more visible. The ocean industries of the future, make them more visible, and make people realise the hidden infrastructure of the oceans, which we all depend on, and the need for resilience in that infrastructure. And then you think about, Ambassador Thompson comes from Fiji. There are so many small island states and poorer countries that nearly all their economy is dependent on the oceans. So there's a real a justice point here. How do we grow the ocean economy, which is also a just way of growing it? Where are the good jobs going to be into the future? And so that just transition is needed, and I know Martha's going to talk about that a bit later. So that old knowledge, Peter talked about it. Actually, we can come here and say, oh, this is all new, but actually there's a lot of old knowledge there. There's a lot of local knowledge. There's a lot of knowledge that needs to be respected in that just transition. So that's the industries of the ocean. And the other thing that we want to make more visible is the natural capital of the ocean. So if you talk about the ocean economy, we can't just talk about ships and pipelines and things like that. What we need to build in is the knowledge and the goods and services, the natural capital that the ocean supplies to us. And we've talked about human health. 1 in every 2 breaths we breathe comes from the oceans. The food that we eat comes from the oceans. And as the oceans change, that food will become less safe to eat. So how are we protecting our own health? By protecting the oceans. So that we depend on the oceans for our health, our welfare, and safety. Our safety comes from that. And the functioning of our planet comes from that. I know we've got some great scientists in the room today. And the scientists, we look at the ocean system. We talked about the meteorological system just now. The functioning of our planet depends on the oceans, and the functioning of its peoples depends on the oceans as well. So then thinking about why now, well, this inflection point, I think we're at an inflection point, and we're looking at this ocean industry, which is going to double. It's expected to double by 2030. So how will we build into the financing of those industries the right measures to stop them messing up our planet even more? How do we build in the indicators that will help us to make good choices about finance, so that we're not just building things, these infrastructures which they last 20, 30, 40, 50 years, and the remains of them will be there for hundreds of years, How do we build in the right choices as we create that infrastructure going forward? So we've got to build in measures into our investments, into our finances. And then, so just to finish off, I want to say what the foundation is doing going forward. What are we doing? So already, we fund lots of research and development. We build evidence and insight, and we're always looking for partners in this. We've got some work going on, hopefully some of you have seen it, about our seaweed manifesto, where we realized that seaweed was a growing, it could be a growing economic force, but it was too fragmented, and we brought people together to sort of converge their voices around seaweed. So that's something else that we're doing that you'll see on the agenda at the moment. But going forward, there are sort of 3 immediate things that we want to do. Number 1, we're going to be opening up something called an Ocean Safety Index. We're going to be developing an index of shareable, transparent, good quality data that investors can use to decide how and when to put money into ocean projects. And that will be opening soon, and we're looking for partners to help develop that index. And the index will have everything from, sort of scientific data about the environment, to economic data, to skills data, to socioeconomic data. The second area is that we're going to be promoting this idea of ocean citizenship. And if we think about that, we want everyone to know about not only their rights and responsibilities towards the ocean, but also the responsibilities to the people that work in the ocean, to the people who are on ships, to the people who are out fishing, to the people who are laying pipelines, to the people who live in coastal communities and whose welfare depends on it. So that's another concept that we're going to be putting forward to. And this is a great example in this supply chain discussion. Supply chains is a very important part of how we promote good citizenship. And the third thing we're doing is very shortly we'll be publishing what we're calling a foresight review of ocean engineering. And basically taking some of these sectors and mapping them out and saying what is the engineering that we need for the future to make that work in a sustainable way. And that will do several things. It will support educational priorities around the world. How do we reinvent engineering? We've got lots of engineers in the room today. Many people who start in engineering are people who make things happen. They turn science into action, and they're going to be the ones that are driving this forward. But engineers need to start challenging backwards on a set of values, not just saying this is how you do it, but why are we doing it? What's the purpose of what we're doing, and how do we build in those values into the engineering we do? So that's a way forward for us in ocean engineering. And then the third thing that we want to do is actually on the technical standards. What are those safe infrastructures going to look like? How do we make sure that we can remove things at the end of the day? How do you decommission? All this offshore wind, there's no good plan for how we stop that. There's no good plan for what happens when those structures start crumbling. So we need to build these things in the future. So the next steps for us, is looking for partners. And I'm really glad that this panel is highlighting the NHS, actually. Because I know you're going to say some great things about the NHS and show us, just the kind of role that the private sector, the public sector, but private bodies, you're a non-governmental body. What is it that we can do to make this happen? Thanks, Suzanne.
Thanks, Ruth. That was great. Very interesting to hear what the foundation is doing. And just to give an order of the size of the magnitude, the foundation's in this, very wonderful position, because from what you've told me, it takes the money that it has to grant out into society to make society safer, and then it finds partners and leverages that by a factor of 4. So the foundation's giving portfolio on a leveraged basis is something like $1 billion in the next several years. So that makes a difference, and it will be really exciting to see who comes to the foundation looking to partner on Ocean Safety Index, on just transition, on ocean engineering, and on ocean citizenship, and developing technical standards for developing the ocean.
Thanks, Suzanne. But we're about to be dwarfed by the NHS's budget, so
okay.
you go for it.
Okay. Well, all right. On that note, let's turn to Richard Hickson, because yes, you actually are you're the founder of NHS Oceans. You're also a critical care doctor yourself. That's your day job.
It is.
NHS Oceans is an incredible organization that now looks at helping to make sure the supply chain and the broader footprint of the NHS is safe, particularly within the oceans. So tell us a little bit more about it. And in terms of size, yes, I do know that the NHS is the largest employer in Europe. Is that right?
That's correct, yeah. I think it's the 8th largest in the world.
8th largest in the world. Okay, take it away, Richard. Tell us about it.
Thanks very much, Suzanne. And thanks very much to the Malin Group and Lloyd for inviting me. I think it's safe to say that a year ago, as a critical care consultant, if you'd have said that I would be sat here in the Malin Group on the banks of the River Clyde during COP26 when I was in the middle of managing a critical care unit in a global pandemic, I wouldn't have believed you. I think that is safe to say. NHS Ocean has only existed since October the 20th last year. I think that's when we had our first meeting between Georgie Soman, Laura Fleming and myself. A lot has happened in this last year. So my origins is that I'm a critical care consultant. That means I use a lot of stuff. I use a lot of consumables, a lot of pharmaceuticals, a lot of equipment, a lot of energy, and I generate a lot of waste. About 3.5 kilos of single-use plastics per patient per day, just to put that in perspective. I started to become interested, it was a little over a year ago, but where all the stuff was coming from, how it came to me. And I was just a amateur ocean enthusiast. And so I started asking questions, and I was really surprised that no one really knew how the stuff was getting into the country and what the impacts of this were on oceanic health. I also was very aware, the more I read, that oceans were not really featuring in global healthcare strategy. And I thought this was odd. You know, even as an amateur enthusiast, I knew that the oceans gave us food, it gave us medicines, transportation, livelihood. It sequestered huge amounts of carbon, 16 times more than the land, 50 times more than atmosphere. So I couldn't see how we were focusing very much on land and atmosphere, but just kind of missing oceans out of the healthcare conversation. Not so long ago, we started using a phrase called the climate emergency as a health emergency. And this started, I think it was in Newcastle with James Dixon's team. And what this basically means is as the climate gets worse, it impacts upon our health, whether that's heat-related injury, infectious diseases, trauma from adverse weather events, drowning, lack of food, lack of pharmaceuticals, whatever. It's when climate change becomes personal. It affects, as our first speaker said, it affects the health and well-being of each and every one of us and our loved ones. So I started thinking, well, okay, if we're missing oceans in our thinking with respect to climate change, well, why don't I spend a bit of time looking at what would happen with degrading oceans? And I decided that actually climate emergency was actually an oceanic emergency, and an oceanic emergency was also a health emergency. Some of the predictions were just so scary. You know, the GOES Foundation predicting a tipping point for carbonate-based life being the early 2040s. And as we know, to paraphrase Sylvia Earle, no blue, no green, no life. If the oceans become toxic, the air becomes toxic, and the land becomes toxic. The climate crisis is also a healthcare crisis. Healthcare is itself not benign. It's responsible for 5% of global carbon emissions and huge amounts of macro and molecular pollution. The NHS every year produces 660,000 tons of waste that has to be dealt with. The more our health deteriorates, the more we lean on healthcare. The more healthcare we provide, the more we fuel the climate crisis. The more that affects our health, and the more healthcare we provide, and so on until it breaks. Either we break it voluntarily, or it breaks, and we can no longer provide healthcare. And our supply chains are absolutely essential to consider. 62% of the NHS's carbon output is through its supply chains, and that includes the shipping industry. And 80% of our goods come into the UK on container ships. And as we all know, these have carbon harms, roughly a gigaton of CO2 emissions every year. Other emissions, then we have all the non-carbon harms, marine mammal collisions, transfer of invasive species, oceanic noise, and pollution. So this is all part of the big picture, but I'm not saying shipping is the enemy here, because if shipping is the enemy, well, actually human healthcare produces twice the number of emissions, or twice the amount of emissions, as global shipping. So healthcare is the enemy too. So I think we're all in one and the same boat here. So I decided, sorry, that was a terrible pun, sorry. So I decided I needed actions. We could not just keep stating the same thing over and over and over again. So I started looking for an action, and my action was through this provider, supplier, carrier axis. We have providers of healthcare on one side, we have suppliers of goods on the other side, and in the middle we've got these great container ships sitting on the oceans, and that was my link for healthcare through to the oceans. We have three critical documents, in my opinion, three critical documents. We have NHS Net Zero, Policy Procurement Note 620, and what is coming out next year, which is the Evergreen Supplier Framework. And I believe it is through these three documents we can address carbon, nature-based solutions, and all do this through this axis of providers, carriers, and suppliers. And we've got our first proposal for our first shipping question to be included in the supplier framework for trial next year. And what I love about all of this is if we get carriers on board, if we get providers changing, and if we get healthcare systems changing, everybody wins. Everybody involved in this supply chain wins, and so does the planet. Thank you.
That's exciting. What an inspiration. You're making some change, that's for sure. How easy was it? And are people really listening to you?
Yeah, I won't say it was easy. It took a year, but what I think is fantastic is our healthcare leaders are listening. They're approaching this just like everybody else, you know, a blank sheet of paper. So they're finding their way. And I think bringing oceans into the conversation, it was a challenge, but the persistence is paying off. And they're listening, and I believe that early next year we are going to start seeing actions in this area.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
What about, so, you know, you've just described how big you are, and you're one of the biggest global end users. Other companies are coming forward too. There's other initiatives, and you know, you're sitting with the likes of Amazon and Unilever, and you know, do you see going beyond NHS and coming together with other end users, big end users, to create change? Could you see that? Well,
being one of 1.4 million employees, I'll speak personally rather than for the whole NHS. But what I would say is, certainly one of my goals for next year would be for the NHS to stand up and to join something similar to COSEV, and actually stand side by side with the private sector with respects to supporting these global goals, which I think is absolutely essential. The NHS has done so well with NHS Net Zero. It is doing, Greener NHS is an amazing organisation that is progressing at a rate of knots rarely seen within an organisation as large as the NHS. And they've stood up and said, we will be the first net zero healthcare system in the world. And I would love them to also stand up and say, we will join COSEV, we will join these other organisations, and we will pledge to use zero emission shipping by 2040.
Great. Well, we'll be watching you. Thank you so much. Now, I want to go to the screen. And hello, can you see me, Quentin?
Yes.
Great.
Hello, Suzanne.
Thanks for joining us. We have Quentin Hainaut, who's on the screen, and he is leading the freight compliance around the world from Baxter Healthcare. And Baxter is one of the largest healthcare companies that delivers very critical chronic and acute medical condition treatments to people around the world. So this is so important. If their products don't get to the end users and to the patients, then there's a real problem. And so Quentin is focused on the logistics of getting these shipments there. And you were a very early mover in sustainable shipping and sustainable logistics. Tell us a little bit about that, and then let's unpick it a little bit.
Thanks, Suzanne, and good evening, everyone. I think I should start with mentioning what is Baxter's mission. Baxter's mission is to save and sustain lives. So it's of course about the products that we manufacture and distribute, and you have well summarized some of our main product lines. But our corporate responsibility is also an integral part of that. And with such a mission of saving and sustaining lives, we definitely cannot close our eyes to climate change, and the previous speakers have illustrated some of the catastrophic consequences we would face if we don't take action. So clearly that's something that we considered as an integral part of our mission to act. And we've recently issued our next generation corporate responsibility goals, which includes a target to achieve carbon neutrality by 2040 for direct operations, including transportation. Now, clearly transportation is recognized as a sector which is hard to abate, and one of the main challenge, and specifically if we talk about ocean, is the availability of large-scale solutions to large-scale low-carbon solutions, and the long lifespan of such assets. So clearly that means also that we need to take action now, and I mentioned the 2040 objective, but that doesn't mean that we should wait. On the contrary, if we don't take action now, this objective will never be reached. So that's what we've recognized as a logistics group within Baxter, and really the need to start moving and take action. And before I illustrate what we've started to put in place, and we also started from a blank sheet of paper, just a few words about ocean. And I will not repeat what has been said about the critical role of ocean, but I'll just highlight that from a shipping perspective, ocean is definitely our largest mode of transportation, if I can say, in terms of volume transported and in terms of distance, especially for international shipments. So within the transportation and the need to decarbonize transportation, clearly ocean is a critical piece of it. Now, if we look at what we've put in place, and it's an ongoing journey, there is definitely much more to be done moving forward. But what we've started with is really ensuring global adherence within the company. So alignment from local organization, whether it's transport or supporting function, to the senior management. Because if there is not a clear understanding that it's as much a priority as delivering the products, and that we cannot ignore that, there would be a risk that we are not able to achieve significant progress and to act fast. So that was one thing. A second element was to ensure that since we're coming with targets, with objectives to reduce emission, we need to have a reliable and robust methodology to report our emissions. So for ocean freight, we're using clean cargo, and I'll develop a bit more on that in few seconds. But the clean cargo methodology allows to really reflect more accurate emission factors that are carrier specific and trade lane specific. So really allowing us to understand the performance of our partner, as well also as the potential hotspots. So really measuring the right way was really key. Then we also looked at, let's say, what I could call the low end. What can we do to reduce our footprint quickly, and which is already under our control? And one example of that is what we call ocean consolidation. So, for example, we have multiple manufacturing sites in Europe. We export from those sites across the world. Instead of having each site shipping its own containers, we have them shipping to a platform close to the port of Antwerp, so that we can put more products into containers and ultimately have far less containers on the ocean that we would have been without doing that. And it's probably the key one, and that's why I'm finishing with that, is the collaboration aspect. So we're one actor in the chain, so we cannot succeed on our own. Definitely we have a key role to play, but we need to collaborate with our carrier, we need to collaborate with our customers. But if we look at the upstream part, so our carriers, we've joined, and still in the ocean area, we've joined the Clean Cargo Working Group that I mentioned for the methodology. But that's also key in terms of sending a signal to the industry. So by joining Clean Cargo, and Clean Cargo, for those who don't know it, is a leading initiative with carriers, forwarders, and cargo owners such as us, with a dedicated vision to reduce the environmental footprint of shipping. So joining this initiative, and we've been the first healthcare company to join it, also sends a clear signal to our partners that we're really looking at making some improvements in that area. And I'll finish on that note. So really for us, as I said, collaboration is the key to succeed. There is no way we can achieve that without collaboration. And I mentioned carrier, I mentioned customers. Of course, it goes beyond that. It was mentioned previously to include that in financing projects, to ensure there are investments, to ensure that there are scalable technologies that we can then use, and still ensure that we're able to deliver our products on time and at the right place, which is of course something that we cannot compromise on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Interesting also, you know, that you've been doing this for a while now. I think you joined Clean Cargo Initiative kind of at the beginning of the century, is that right?
No, the Clean Cargo Initiative was created in 2002, but we only joined about 1 year ago. So from our end, it's quite recent, and as I said, it's part of our roadmap, but Clean Cargo exists since 2002.
Yeah, and how internally, you know, what were the drivers to get you to join? Was that something that, you know, how did you choose Clean Cargo Initiative? And as you were settling and focusing in on how to be more sustainable?
Yeah, the starting point was really about how can we measure and report our emissions accurately, and how can we capture carrier performance. So that was the starting point. And since Clean Cargo is covering 85% of global container shipments, that was really the right initiative to join for that. But then we also saw the interest around transfer knowledge, benchmarking, sharing best practices, and as I said, also making a clear signal to our suppliers that by joining Clean Cargo, we have high expectations in terms of actions and plans to make shipping greener.
Great. Thank you very much. It's interesting to see now you taking a leadership position in this, and we'll come back and ask more questions about methodology and approach after the panel. Thank you very much. So you mentioned shipping, and I want to turn now to my left, and we have Catherine Palmer here, who's the shipping lead for the High Level Climate Champions team. And that is the group that works to move non-state actors, so the private sector in particular, to help raise the ambitions for decarbonized shipping. So Catherine, you've been here since the beginning of COP. You know, what are you, tell us what you're seeing in terms of the changing nature of the shipping dialogue and what you've been seeing in ambitions and action.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction, Suzanne. So I think, like you said, we are obviously here during COP26, and all eyes are on Glasgow at the moment. Very much focused on climate change, and most people think that this is related to greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere. But I think what most people don't know is that the ocean is also a vital part of our climate system, and is really something that is saving us from ourselves and the climate change we are causing. So I think what I've seen throughout the first week is very much oceans becoming part of the solution and being central to the dialogue around action. And therefore, you know, it is a critical part of our life support system and the reason that the planet remains habitable. And so whereas often we see the ocean is seen as a resource that we can just take from, rather than the fact that it is a system that we need to protect and nurture. So it's very much often portrayed as a victim of climate change, but I think really it's the unsung hero. and something that we really need to start changing the narrative on, and think about how we can enlist the ocean to help us save ourselves from the climate change that we have created. And so specifically for myself as the shipping lead, when I listen to the speakers before me, what is it that is connecting all this together? It is the shipping system. And the interconnectedness of the shipping system make it such a powerful source of solution to take action as leaders are stepping up during these 2 weeks to take action. And so shipping needs to be integral to these discussions as well as the oceans. And I think for most nations and companies, it's, they're making their net zero by 2050 claims and targets, but it's not going to be possible to achieve these without tackling shipping emissions. And so they need to ensure that they have a plan in place for shipping emissions as well. And tackling emissions cannot be solved without shipping, and tackling shipping emissions cannot be solved by shipping alone. So there very much is this interconnectedness of how shipping is that link between human health, the healthcare system, the health of the oceans, and the fair, equitable, just approach. So to ensure that everyone can live as society in conditions that we need. So I think my role as the shipping lead at the Climate Champions is slightly different to what's going off across the water in plenary negotiations. My role is here to build momentum and ambition amongst non-state actors within the shipping ecosystem. So that includes everybody, whether it be corporations, investors, cities, regions, and as well as private sector companies. And it's about these organisations that can drive immediate change within the shipping system. And at the heart of this effort within the high-level Climate Champions team is our campaign, which is called Race to Zero. It's the largest alliance of non-state actors coming together to set science-based targets to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 or preferably sooner. But as of today, we currently only have 2 ship owners in the Race to Zero. Race to Zero as a whole is more than 5,000 members with more than 15% of the global economy, and the non-state actor voice in these political negotiations is being listened to and is being heard. But where is the shipping voice in this with only 2 ship owners in the Race to Zero? So for me, I really do encourage ship owners and other actors within the maritime ecosystem to really look at setting those science-based targets, joining the Race to Zero, and having a non-state actor voice at the table with the politicians and the policy negotiators. But earlier this year, at the Climate Champions, we established the importance of 2030 breakthrough targets. And so for shipping, what does that mean? We have a 2030 breakthrough target of 5% of international shipping fuels will be made up of zero-emission fuels by 2030, and 15% of domestic shipping fuels by 2030. So how are we going to achieve this? The shipping industry will need to combine and accelerate various different change levers. Technology and supply, customer demand, we've heard from Baxter here, setting the demand, financing, policy, and also civil society action. We shouldn't forget about the voice of civil society. So I think from a technology and supply perspective, this is really where the center of the conversation for shipping system transformation to zero is focused very much around that techno-economic conversation, where zero-emission ships and zero-emission fuel technologies need to be trialled and demonstrated at large scale. And we need to ensure operational and safety standards in place, which will ultimately drive down the costs, encourage larger supply, and enable us to increase the uptake to achieve our 5% goal by 2030. Financing. The finance sector has many levers that they can pull as well to incentivize better financing options for zero-emission shipping. We're already seeing examples such as the Poseidon Principles, but these will evolve. These will get more stringent. And we need to look at different ways of financing assets over a longer period of time. The policy framework is going to be needed on various different levels, whether that's national governments putting in place policy to decarbonise and support first movers, as well as implementing multiple international zero carbon shipping routes. And also on the international level, intensified effort is going to be needed to agree on mid to long-term measures, which are going to include market-based measures, developing life cycle assessment guidelines, and also committing to zero emissions before 2050. Demand is another lever which needs to be pulled. Freight purchasers need to commit, and we've already had mention of the COSEV initiative. And for those who aren't aware of the COSEV initiative, this is a group of cargo owners committing to zero emission vessels. So at the moment, we have 9 cargo owners. These are significant retail brands, household names, Amazon, Unilever, Michelin, Patagonia, household names that are committing to only using 100% decarbonised maritime freight by 2040. So sending that demand signal, down the supply chain to say, look, we want it quicker. So what is stopping you? And then obviously, as I mentioned, the civil society, we cannot forget that this transition and approach needs to be equitable and just, not leaving anyone behind. And that's not only on an individual personal level for workers in the maritime sector, but it's also for those who are the most vulnerable and impacted by climate change, such as the least developing countries and small island developing states. So I think what I would say is, it's incredible to see so many countries and companies working at speed to increase and accelerate shipping's journey to zero emission vessels. There are a lot of private sector collaborations that we can talk about, and Ambassador Thompson mentioned some that he'd heard earlier last week. But I think, we do need to accelerate these if we are going to achieve that 2030 breakthrough. And so from my perspective, looking at what people are doing by committing to R&D pilot projects, investing in the production of zero carbon fuels, and even those that are ordering zero emission ready vessels today. So I think, this need for engaging the full value chain in radical collaboration and partnerships is something that is going to be really essential, and something that I hope, we can take away from COP, we can take away from Glasgow, public-private partnerships coming together to commit to first mover projects, and how we transfer the knowledge and experience from those first mover projects to everyone else, so we take everyone with us on this journey, and accepting that people will move at different paces, but we all will move in the same direction. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. You did a great job for painting the picture that we need. Decarbonizing shipping is not just about the ships, and it takes a holistic, systemic approach. But some of the words that you mentioned in some of the parties, those are relatively new to the piecing together the puzzle, aren't they? So the end users, or making policy up front, or, how much has this dialogue around shipping and the ambitions come on in the past year? It feels like this is, the conversation is so different as even a year ago or 2 years ago. And what have been the main changes, and what are spurring on this advancement? Because this is a whole different conversation this year than last year.
Yeah, and I think next year will be a completely different conversation to this year. Things are moving at, I guess what it sort of feels like, I've worked in the shipping industry all my career, and so I can say, we are moving really quickly. It may not seem, people think, the shipping industry is quite slow to move, but actually, like you said, the pace of understanding and awareness and willingness to be engaged in the dialogue. And I think that's where we're getting more and more parties who previously may not have wanted to be part of the narrative and part of the conversation and part of creating the system change that's needed, but actually getting more and more parties to engage in that. And I think there's room for more around the table, so I would encourage everyone to sort of come and be part of creating the future of the shipping industry.
Thank you. Let me go on to Martha Selwyn now, because I want to pick up on a point that you raised, Catherine, towards the end. And that's something around, everybody has kind of mentioned it in one way or the other, which is the just transition. And I think that's something around the human element of this transition in the sustainable ocean economy, but also in this transition to a cleaner world. And it's about a green transition, but it's human-centric, and it's about a human transition. So Martha Selwyn, you're at the UN Global Compact on the ocean team, and you've been looking very closely at the just transition and making it fair and equitable. Tell us a little bit about what you're seeing at COP, but also tell us how you view the just transition, and then what's coming out of the UN right now?
Another small question, Suzanne.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Excellent. No, firstly, thank you so much for letting me be here. It's been a really inspiring panel. My speech is now covered in notes from what other people have been saying, so that's really helpful. I think, when we talk about just transition, it reminds me of a session I went to at the very beginning of COP, and it was around business standards and climate and net zero. And we had this great discussion, amazing panelists, and at the end, someone came up and asked a question, and the question was, do we all know what we mean by net zero? And we'd all been discussing it this whole time, and actually everyone had a little bit of a different definition. And I think we're kind of getting into a little bit of that same territory when we talk about just transition, because what's great is that we're talking about it. It's really high on the agenda, which is awesome to see. But are we all talking about the same thing when we're talking about just transition? So I think broadly speaking, we're talking about something that, as Suzanne also mentioned, we're trying to bridge people and planet. So we're talking about emissions, but not in a silo. I saw this great meme recently about carbon tunnel vision. We just look at emissions, just look at this, but what about everything around that? So I think just transition is a kind of framework to think about bridging variables in that respect. But how I find it helpful is to think about it in sort of 2 dimensions and 2 stages. So on the one hand, one dimension is looking at it more through a sort of workforce lens. And that's kind of where it came from originally, sort of labor movements, looking at it. So what does it mean for a workforce? What will it mean for a worker working in a carbon-intensive industry to transition out? What kind of new skills might they have to acquire? What kind of new, decent jobs might come out of the transition? What about the safety? How can we assure that any kind of new industry, that we have adequate safety standards? So these kind of workforce considerations, ensuring that it is just, that workers are not left behind. But we also are now talking about it in a much broader sense, because in a way, we're also talking about how we can use climate action to address existing disparities. So it's not just about a just transition for a workforce, it's also about how can we use this transition to reduce existing inequalities that would exist regardless of whether we were having a green transition. So, for instance, gender equality. In a way, if you look at a lot of just transition strategies, actually a lot of them address the gender dimension and sort of using this as a way to increase women's participation. Then, of course, climate justice. This was mentioned by Suzanne, this was mentioned by Catherine. How can we use climate policies to address climate justice and inequality? So, for instance, I can see Mark Button right in front of me, who showed me this really interesting new policy called the Climate Smart Ports Act. And what's interesting about this is it's putting environmental injustice right at the center of a Green Ports Act. So addressing the fact that communities living close to the port were suffering from pollution and job loss, and how can we actually green the port in a way that's also giving co-benefits for that community. So you're seeing here, we're moving in a way away from a sort of the workforce lens to benefits for communities and addressing wider disparities. And then when I say stages, so those are the 2 dimensions, there are 2 stages, and I think it's really useful, particularly if we're talking about supply chains, to think about, on the one hand, we're transitioning out. So what does that mean? So transitioning out from an industry, how can we make sure that a transition out is well managed, is not disorderly, and being, looking ahead and seeing how that might work. But I think for the supply chain discussion, transitioning in is really important, because I feel we're in a dangerous place almost where we equate green with good. So we talk about new industries like offshore wind. This is obviously great when we're talking about reducing emissions, but what is this new value chain? What are the new minerals? I saw a crazy statistic recently about that in 2050, we will need more copper than we will have ever dug out in human history. So where is that coming from? And when we transition in, what are the new supply chains that we need to really be keeping a look at from a human rights perspective? So you asked me about COP. What are we seeing at COP? It is high on the agenda. So we had a Just Transition Declaration signed by, I think, around 30 nations. And here, I would argue it's more Dimension 1, so looking more at that kind of workforce lens, but also, really importantly, a commitment to look at the new supply chain and ensure that it has no adverse effects, particularly on marginalized communities. And having that supply chain element there means it's on the agenda. And then another interesting thing was there was this new partnership that was announced. We've heard a lot about partnerships and how this is incredibly important. And there's this partnership that's been announced between the UK, the EU, the US, and Germany, I think, to support South Africa in a just energy transition. So it's mainly here around coal and moving away from the coal industry, but here job focus, reskilling, retraining is sort of at the center of this partnership and support. So those are some of the things that we've seen around COP, but as I said, I think being clear that we're talking about the same thing is really important in this respect. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So we've been talking today about maritime and supply chains. Taking a look at what you just said about just transition and the various scopes, when you think about maritime and what we're talking about here, how would the just transition apply, or what kinds of things would you be thinking about?
Once again, my notes are now so long from what everyone has said, because there's been so much about this, but I think my immediate reaction to the conversation is we're talking about COSEV, we're talking about initiatives that are basically cargo owners demanding green shipping, and that's amazing, that's what we need. But what about the other part of supply chain due diligence, which is human rights due diligence? So on the one hand, we're saying cargo owners are demanding zero-emission vessels, and that's great. But what about the other leverage that cargo owners have, which is to demand better working conditions for the people working on ships? And what we saw in COVID, I've worked with all of you pretty much on this, is that COVID really exposed a human rights blind spot in the maritime industry. So due to the pandemic, number of seafarers, I think at the high point, I'm looking at Natasha from IMO there, it's around 800,000 seafarers who were affected. So 400,000 couldn't actually get off, and then another 400,000 couldn't get on. So also damaging their livelihoods because they couldn't gain employment, etc. And this was a part of, 90% of global trade goes via ships. So that means that essentially most businesses are reliant on this to transport their goods. And businesses are stepping up. Since we've had the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, it's part of your corporate social responsibility to take action on human rights. And yet there was this whole part of the supply chain that just wasn't included in human rights due diligence. So I think it's great we're talking about COSEV. I think it's great we're talking about what can cargo owners, what can consumers do to drive zero-emission shipping, but what can they also do to drive better working conditions? And it's here where just transition is so important. Because as I mentioned at the beginning, if we think about it as a bridge between climate and human rights, and if we think of it as a way of thinking about how these two connect with each other, then is there a way that we can also call on cargo owners to take a just transition approach? So they're demanding zero-emission vessels, but are they talking about whether there's an employment plan? Are they talking about, how they're retraining their workers? Are they talking about if they're engaging in social dialogue with seafarers? So I know it's sometimes hard to look beyond our silos and, we work on this and we work on that, but is just transition a framework? Oh, dramatic. It was very dramatic. But is just transition a framework to bridge between the two and, find ways that we can, demand green, but also just shipping? So just some food for thought there.
Great, thank you so much. Well, now let's just turn. Does anybody have any questions? We've heard about making oceans safer, end users, shippers, shipping, and the way it's done. Love to open up to the floor if you want to ask anybody any questions, and also to our viewers online as well.
We've got questions from online. One of the questions is, and I think it's probably pitched at Catherine, it's a consumer push for low shipping when ocean sustainability is more associated with plastics and overfishing. Sorry. Did that come through? No. I'll try again. The question for Catherine, how should we accelerate a consumer push for low GHG shipping when ocean sustainability is more associated with ocean plastics and overfishing?
Oh.
Yeah, I get that. Well, I guess, and feel free to chip in, fellow panelists, if you've got some thoughts on this. But I think that's quite interesting. Whoever's saying that ocean sustainability is, plastics is one part of it. It's not all of it. And so I guess there's a little bit about understanding what do we mean by ocean sustainability. And I guess that goes back to the fact, having a common and shared understanding. Martha mentioned it about, has everyone got the same interpretation of the term just transition? Does everyone understand what we mean when we say net zero? Does everyone understand what we mean when we say ocean sustainability? I think there's lots of terms used in our everyday language, whereas I might think something very different to the person I'm talking to about it, and I assume that they have the same shared and common understanding as I do. So I think there's a little bit that we can all do there around alignment around this kind of shared set of definitions, and it doesn't just stop at ocean sustainability. But I think I said so. I think having some of the large retail household brands come out and make commitments is a step in the right direction. To start getting people to think about, well, if I order something from Amazon, that is eventually, it's going to have shipping in its supply chain to get to me. But I think these commitments from the retail brands can really help in educating the end consumer, which is you and I, as we go out and do our daily shopping. So I think there's just and obviously I think maybe as the shipping industry, we are one of the main ocean industries, the oldest ocean industry, and the one that is integral to society. And we probably do need to be being more vocal about saying it did come by sea, and sea transportation was included in that, and just raising that awareness. Anyone else?
Go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, I think just picking up on the microplastics, which is obviously very topical, I think this tunnel vision with respects to carbon can be, I think it's, we've got to see beyond that. I'm just picking my words very carefully here. What we need is a healthy ecosystem, and healthy ecosystems function. And they functioned for millions of years until we upset the balance within those ecosystems. Carbon is just one of the factors that upsets those ecosystem balance. And if you look at what we produce in hospitals, we have forever chemicals coming out of our hospitals. We have pharmaceutical waste, we have pharmaceutical metabolite waste, we have detergents, and all these will affect the oceanic ecosystem along with microplastics. And I like to see it as, the way I kind of look at it myself is that we can become very focused on carbon. We can aim for net zero, whatever that means. We can call it a low carbon economy. But if we poison the oceans, then their ability to mitigate what is left, the residuals, decreases, because even such simple organisms as phytoplanktons will stop photosynthesizing when they ingest microplastics. And who knows what half the other chemicals do that we put in the ocean. So we could find that the finish line just keeps disappearing over the horizon because we focus on net zero, but actually the mitigation, the residuals just aren't being dealt with, and therefore, you know, actually net zero gets further and further and further away because we end up with a poisoned ecosystem. So I think it's a whole biosphere approach that is absolutely important here. And we need to focus on that, and we mustn't be looking in the wrong direction as we move forward.
Thank you. Nothing's easy. Ruth.
Thank you. I'd like to sort of chip in on this question, and a question about consumer driving as well. And I'd like to talk about evidence and insight and information and shared information, and just the way that our new society goes. You know, we have so much more in our hands to help us make choices now. And I was reflecting on flights, you know, booking a flight. When I need to book a flight, I go to a platform called Kayak. And now you can click on the button and it tells you, okay, if you take that flight, you can compare the different flight options and the carbon that they are producing according to the age of the airplane, the route it's taking, the time of day, you know, and you can start to, and it's not perfect. These things are not perfect. And I think, you know, lots of scientists in the room probably going, well, that's not going to be right and that's not going to be right. But actually, we just need to kind of move in a direction here. It may not be perfect information. We may not have it right first time. But let's use information we've got and start to share it and start to make that actionable insight into what our choices are. So wouldn't it be great if next time we bought off Amazon, you know, let's withhold judgment about taking flights or buying off Amazon, but say Amazon put up, okay, I think that product is coming from here. Let's just do a finger in the air calculation on some carbon just to help you make a better decision about that. You know, about how you sort of make these trade-offs. And let's move in the right direction. And I have to say, this does remind me of some of the discussions we've had in the last couple of years about racism and about slavery and about our past. And I think, and listening to what you're saying, Martha, you know, we're making choices today that probably would have been recognizable several hundred years ago during the emancipation of slavery. You know, to sort of bring out into the open some of the conditions under which people live in order to bring us the lifestyle we have today. Now, in order to make that move forward, what we can't do is not talk about it. You know, what we can't do is ignore it. We might not be able to make absolutely morally right choices at the moment, or really good choices even, because we all need certain things, but we can move forward, and we can move that forward in the right direction using evidence, using insight, using information. So I'm just, you know, anyone out there who's sort of thinking of making apps and, you know, bringing data out and using the evidence that's already out there to translate that into actionable insight, I just commend that. I commend all the sort of the back bedroom warriors who are trying to give us information about the choices we make, and I think that's part of the answer to the question about consumer pressure.
Thank you. And I bet, Quentin, I bet that you are probably in the process of developing something that's similar to a shipping kayak that Ruth just described, in terms of, you know, identifying really what those emissions are and how to make it more efficient, the whole system in terms of the cargo and everything. So I think there's a real connection to what Quentin was talking about. And if we had more time, I would love to hear more about your metrics and your approach. And I hope I have the chance, I hope we all have the chance to sit down and have an in-depth session with you about that. But I do see that we have run out of time. And I wonder, and I'm sorry for the questions that we didn't get. Just a thought, because we've heard a number of themes today. And could we just, everybody on the panel, in one word, yes. No, please, go ahead.
Well, I had a question that was perfectly formed, but rather like Martha, I just kind of went through your previous, the next answer and thought, wow, there's just more stuff. So I'm Diane Gilpin, and I'm from Smart Green Shipping, and it has been the most fantastic panel. Really, really inspirational, really enriching. So thank you all. It's been absolutely fantastic. To talk about interconnectedness has been really, really important. We hardly ever touch on that. We're always talking about this, that, and blaming somebody. So what I'm really interested in is, and I'm feeling a bit embarrassed now because I'm kind of focusing back on emissions, which is just very narrow-minded of me. But, you know, we've got this kind of focus on 2040. We've got really brilliant initiatives going on. What worries me is what are we doing now, and what are we doing to start to reduce emissions, particularly from shipping? And I know that there's demand coming through, and I'm worried about the kind of substitution strategy that we only ever talk about alternative fuel in shipping, and there are other near-term solutions that we could start to be thinking about, but they don't seem to get as much airspace. So I wonder if I could just ask the panel to have a little conversation about that for a moment, even though you've got to be quiet. And
Do you want to start, Catherine?
Danny probably knows my answer. I completely agree with you. There are actions that can be taken today to improve the energy efficiency and reduce the energy demand on ships. And I think, you know, really, that should be happening, you know. And I think, you know, we say longer term, but, you know, 2030, 2040, 2050, you know, there is still going to be a need in some parts of the shipping sector for a liquid fuel. Unless you're telling me we can do it. Yes, exactly. That's what I'm saying. Yes. Yes. So there is going to be a need for, so I think that's why a lot of the conversation is around what is that replacement on the liquid fuel. But you need to reduce your demand side of that fuel, because if you're using more efficient technology, whether that be wind assist, whether that be air lubrication, whatever it is to reduce that energy demand, means that zero carbon fuel, liquid fuel that you're still using, or is you're not going to need as much, and therefore the cost. You know, so I think the energy efficiency technology and operational improvements should be happening. We have regulation in place to incentivize that. We have the proven technology. It should be happening.
Thank you, thank you. And we'll take this as our last question. Thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Vanessa, and I run a project called London Sail Cargo and Kent Sail Cargo. So we are using schooner sailing ships, beautiful big schooners, to go transatlantic, and then we had essentially a food cooperative with indigenous communities and traditional family farms in Central America and the Caribbean and Portugal at the moment. There's about 3 or 4 ships out there that are doing this at the moment. It's absolutely tiny. But since I've been up here at COP, it's been all about the blue economy and shipping. I'm like, wow, okay. So it's great that you guys are working at such a massive scale. But I would either maybe after this, I'd just really like to know if you see any room in the picture for smaller sail-powered vessels, and specifically what kind of partnerships and financial mechanisms might be available to the completely opposite end of the scale from the Maersk ships that we just kind of sail by quietly along the side. And we're trying to produce that real kind of wind-powered option. A lot of people think it's old-fashioned, but it's very romantic. It's actually very modern, and it's becoming quite a big niche market, connecting up our producers and our consumers with a very short supply chain and completely emission-free. But we need a lot of support, and I would love to know from any of you if you have any feedback or insight for how I could access financial mechanisms to support a completely wind-powered sail cargo. Thank you.
Who would like to respond to that?
I want to respond because I just think that is such a cool thing, you know, that you're doing. And what you know, I was thinking about, you know, you've got a bigger question, which I would point back to Suzanne, actually, because Suzanne is the person that's been looking at finance here and looking at how do we get investment. But and I think that's a really big part of the equation that we haven't really dug into today. But how do we translate what we're trying to do in this room and again, using that data, using actionable insight so that people can make better investments. You know, I don't know about the rest of you, but I sort of looked at my pension the other day and I thought, right, how do I shift the dial on my pension to put my pension into things which I believe in more? How do I make that work for me? And I couldn't find good vehicles for that you know, which talked about the ocean economy, you know, and I was looking for seaweed in particular because I think that's just going to take off. But boy, if I knew how to crowdsource what you're doing, I would invest in that because I think that's great. I think that's great what you're doing, and if there is more, not transparency, but more access to what you're doing, you know, if the NHS could go, right, okay, how do we get a piece of this? You know, how do we get a piece of that zero carbon sailing? You know, it's kind of a disruptor. It's a market disruptor that you could bring into play. But you need to connect your market to your investors. You know, you need to connect the people that want to buy what you've got. So I've got no answer to your question. Maybe Suzanne does, but I just wanted to say, hey, that sounds amazing.
No, I think that, you know, there is a lot of investor money looking for good places to put it. And equally, there's a lot of government and mixed funding that's looking for places. And there's now, you know, there's now focus on all points of the scale, whether it be from startups and small VCs, and this is on blue funding, you know, all the way up to the capital markets who look for really only in the hundreds of millions. But I think that the value, you know, just when you described it and the romantic feeling, but that, you know, in these quiet sails, I mean, I took a breath. And I think that it calls attention to energy and the ocean. And I do also wonder, you know, if that's a part of a bigger investment that might have a number of ways of fueling its ships. And, you know, I wonder if it could be put into a portfolio, for example, because as a poster child or a symbol or a logo for the efforts that a company is trying to champion, you know, it's a beautiful, iconic effort. And so perhaps it could be part of a larger portfolio, one that's commercial at scale, but with a number of different types of fuels too, because one thing we have learned this week is there's lots of funding looking for investments that they can get a return on. But I think that you know, after this conversation, we should connect, and we can think about, you know, what might be some ideas or some investors. Anyway, thank you. I was going to go through and play this game, but I really do think we all need a drink. But we have heard, you know, words like interconnection and holistic, systemic. We've heard leadership and cooperation, and we've used, you know, hidden harm and end users, and really we've heard health. It's been a really rich conversation. So thank you so much to all of the panelists. I hope everybody has a chance for a drink and just a minute to have a chance for us all to talk to each other. Thank you so much for coming today, and I wish you very good rest of the week.